Of the recent vaccination blitz, there is a certain degree of misinformation being circulated amongst members of the corporate Jamaica. Some companies have already begun instructing employees to take the vaccine or face repercussions. But is it legal for companies to mandate that employees take the COVID-19 vaccine? Can a company ask you to resign if you refuse to comply? Let's welcome attorney at law Emile Leiba, legal partner DunnCox Attorneys at Law, to educate us more. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Great. Because there is a particular company that issued a specific memo to the members of staff to say either they take the jab or they lose the job. Now, was that a breach of the Jamaican laws in the first place, Mr. Leiba?
Well, the first concern that one would have there is that the question of forced resignation. So it's either you take the job or you will be asked to resign. Forced resignation can constitute actually a form of dismissal. So basically, it's like saying, if you have a gun to my head and you make me do something, that's not the same thing of me doing something of my own will or volition. And so it would be just that concept in and of itself would not be something that the Jamaican labor system would enforce or uphold.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just for clarity, so not just one company, but generally, you are saying for the public that a company cannot mandate you to take the vaccine?
And as things stand now, I would say no. Certainly, if you look at the population of Jamaica as versus the number of vaccines that are available, then clearly it would be an unenforceable requirement. So even if it was legally permissible and enforceable, it would be an unenforceable requirement in circumstances where the average Jamaican does not have ready access to the vaccine.
Certainly not this government has made that kind of ruling or law, but at the same time, can you speak to the Employment Termination and Redundancy Act? If employers refuse to abide by that, then they could find themselves in some kind of trouble. Is that so?
Yes. Well, when you in any scenario where an employee loses their employment without it being justified or justifiable, then the employer can either be taken to the Ministry of Labor and through that route to the Industrial Disputes Tribunal, or they can be taken to court for a wrongful dismissal claim. And so once it is that the termination is not done properly for good cause, good process, and so on, then that can result in a tribunal ordering reinstatement, meaning that give the employee back their job, and or damages, significant damages representing 1 year's pay, 2 years' pay, things along those lines.
So in light of that, Mr. Leiba, what advice you have for employers? What are the steps that they can take in terms of the measures for better COVID-19 prevention rather than mandating vaccine use?
Encouragement and discussion. Good labor relations practices says that you should engage with your employees. You should speak with them, have a staff meeting, probably a virtual one in the current environment.
Yes.
But have a discussion with them, perhaps bring in an expert who can answer questions that they may have, concerns that they may have about side effects and things like that. And so have them voluntarily decide after and be able to make an informed decision about vaccination. Because a lot of times when people have a position, it's oftentimes due to lack of knowledge, not always. But if they have the opportunity to speak, to get an understanding and that encouragement, you're most likely to achieve your objective through honey rather than vinegar.
So can you, because there are many people in this country who still don't know what their rights are when it comes to, the labor code. And can you just touch a little bit on how an employee can be dismissed, making reference to Jamaica's labor code?
Right. Well, the labor relations code, how it functions is this, is that on principles of natural justice, that an employee should not be dismissed unless it is justifiable in some way. So employment or your job is treated as a right. And so if it is that an employer does not dismisses an employee, let's say, for example, an employee is accused of theft, but then the person who accuses that employee of theft, that employee doesn't know who it is, doesn't know the circumstances, doesn't know anything at all other than someone said that, as we said, them thief something, and they're fired as a result, then that would not be upheld before the IDT. And if you go to the Ministry of Labor, make a complaint, because that's usually a starting point for something like that. And then they will take you through a process of what they call conciliation, which is where an office of the employed to the Ministry of Labor and Social Security chairs a meeting with both sides and attempts to have them agree a resolution to the matter. So sometimes that results in the employer agreeing to take back the employee. Sometimes it results in damages or some other monetary settlement on the basis of a release and discharge. But there are avenues open to employees if they feel that they have not been properly dealt with by their employer, and their termination of their employment has not been dealt with in a proper way, so that they can understand and have an opportunity to respond to any allegations that may have been made against them.
Mm-hmm. And not taking the vaccine is not a justification.
Pardon, I didn't get that.
And not taking the vaccine is not a justification for termination.
Certainly not, unless and until the government mandates it.
Yes.
Under the Public Health Act or some regulations. If it is that it becomes mandatory under the law, and an employer is simply ensuring compliance with the law, then at that point it may be grounds for dismissal or some other form of disciplinary action. Because we should also appreciate that you don't have to dismiss. Dismissal is actually supposed to be a last
resort.
Course. You're not supposed to jump to dismissal unless it's really something so, egregious, abhorrent, something so, as I said, something that has caused the employment relationship to completely break down. The fact that I have said that I am reluctant to take a vaccine should perhaps, if at all, result in a lesser sanction, some kind of suspension, or you can say, well, all right, you have to work remotely until I'm comfortable that we are all safe, or something like that. Or there can be or should be some other way of dealing with and addressing the issue rather than necessarily dismissal, because it doesn't transform the employee into a bad employee. It doesn't mean that suddenly they're not doing their job anymore. But it is simply sometimes that, as I said earlier, they may need some further comfort, some further understanding of what needs to be done before they take it.
And Mr. Leiba, the question you will probably often hear, are employees' constitutional rights violated by mandating or measures taken by companies in light of the failure to want to take the vaccine?
The area of enforcement of constitutional rights between two private parties is always a bit tricky. What I can say is that I'm not aware of any scenario where a contract has been upheld requiring somebody else to inject something into their body. Because this is fundamentally, because it's not most employers, or many employers, I would say, require medical examination. So if you're in an industry where you're handling food, you're interacting with a lot of people, it may be reasonable for your employer to require you to get a medical examination to ensure that you are fit to perform the job. You know, if it is that you're applying for a job that involves a lot of lifting, moving, and so on, and you have certain medical issues back and so on, you may not be fit for the job, and it's reasonable. Because a lot of the whole question, even on a constitutionality issue, on a contractual issue, the question of reasonableness. Is it reasonable for you to require this? Is it reasonable for you to restrict someone's rights? Because the whole issue of constitutionality, it says that let me examine all other laws in the context of the primary rights that they're given, freedom of movement, privacy, and that type of thing. Can I take away that right in some way? And is my taking away that right reasonable in the circumstances? You know, when you look at this whole kind of greater good concept, even with that company in question, you can see that they're saying that it was for the protection of everybody else. So they were trying to put forward a greater good rationale, but I personally don't think we are there yet in terms of science and everything surrounding vaccines.
So as it is now, no employer should alter the terms and conditions of employment where any employee is concerned. And if that is happening, what should the employee do?
Well, an employee is only required to comply with the provisions of their contract or their job description. So let's say, for example, you employ somebody to be a manager. You can't necessarily hand them a broom and say sweep the floor, because it doesn't fall within the scope of their employment and conditions of their employment. So when it is an employer seeks to unilaterally, that means without agreement, add to the terms and conditions of employment, then that will not be upheld. So an employee who has been given an instruction outside the scope of their employment, they should respectfully, perhaps, either refuse, write down, and document why they are refusing and the basis of it and so on, so that they are not subject to a claim of insubordination. That being said, of course, in some instances, you may say your contract may have any other thing as is reasonably required, you know. So you can't, and then of course there are employees who don't even have written contracts. So the scope of what their job description is also sometimes not always
clear,
you know, and clear. But you, again, engage in discussion, because as the employee as well, you don't want to be on the wrong side of the law, where an employer can now properly terminate you for insubordination, which is a failure to follow the reasonable instructions given to you by your employer.
All right. I want to say thank you so much, Mr. Leiba, for talking to us this morning. And the State Minister in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, Xavier, did say that there's no legal ground for companies to dismiss employees who refuse to take the vaccine. Thank you so much. And if you have challenges, call the Ministry of Labour.